Examining the history of crime globally, serial killers are arguably the most feared type of criminals. Although they may look ordinary in daily life, they will show a cruel nature and violent behavior. One of the most chilling of them is the medical serial killer. They don't need knives, guns, or ropes to kill their victims. They don't need to hide from the police, because the hospital itself is where the legal deaths place. A death, whether from a deteriorating condition or multiple organ failure, will not automatically alert the police. With no traces, no autopsies, and no archival records, even the news ignores the deaths in the hospitals. The medical serial killer commits the quietest slaughter from the safest place imaginable. Charles Cullen, one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. He murdered at least 40 patients during his 16-year-long nursing life. Rumors even claim the true number of people killed could be as high as 400 people. On February 22, 1960, an unusually cold night, Charles was born in the West Orange, New Jersey. His 7th month in the world, his father, Edmund, the bus driver, never woke up in the early morning of September 17th. In his infancy, the boy did not know what death was, but he felt the pain in his mother's crying. The childhood house was old. As Charles learned to walk, he also learned to avoid the fists of his peers, the sneers of his sister's boyfriend. When he was 9 years old, Charles tiptoed into the garage to reach for a bottle of chemical solution on a shelf. The bottle felt cold, but without the slightest hesitation, he drank it. This was Charles' first attempt to commit suicide, but it failed. No one cared whether he had ingested the chemical by accident or intentionally, but from that day on, Charles lived like a ghost. Charles's mother was born in the south of England, in a town where the sea breeze blew all year round, and after the World War II, she followed her husband to America. On December 6, 1971, as the evening rain fell on the streets, Charles's mother and his sister were driving home. However, late at night, the hospital called and informed 18-year-old Charles of his mother's death, which Charles later recalled as devastating. When the accident occurred, the hospital did not tell him in time, and, in particular, it cremated the body straight away without even allowing him to go and see his mother for the last time. In the spring of 1978, Charles shoved his books in the trash. He chose to drop out of school and entered the recruiting office. He longed for a place free of ridicule, but what he didn't know was that what awaited him was a place of extreme horror. Charles became a submariner, and while he was on board, he passed confinement tests that would scare even a psychiatrist. It is well known that submariners are the most painstaking among all military personnel. Awaiting them is a narrow space without sunlight or fresh air, filled with a mixture of noise, oil fumes, and body odors. For dozens of days or even months on end, they cannot speak loudly, cannot move around freely, and cannot express their emotions openly. Here is the dictation of a submariner. From the 30th day, the sound of my mother calling me began to ring in my ears. It was not an auditory hallucination, but a very clear one, as if she were standing right behind me, calling my name. Yet, whenever I turned around, there was nothing but pipes and lamps. So I started talking to her every day, murmuring softly to the wall, "Mom, I didn't take a shower today." I know it's wrong, but I can't control that. On the 45th day, I cried in front of the pressure gauge for 20 minutes in the cabin. No one noticed. It's not because I'm tired, but because I suddenly can't remember what my girlfriend looks like. I had a photo of her, but I was too afraid to look at it. Seeing it would only make it harder to remember. One day, I was on the night shift. The temperature in the cabin was 109 degrees Fahrenheit. I was wearing a vest and sweating all over. I suddenly realized that I was dead. I became a ghost. I began to count my heartbeat, 120 times per minute. I counted for 3 hours without moving. I'm afraid that if I move, I will really die. Soon, Charles was promoted to Petty Officer Second Class. Late at night, a year later, the chief sergeant pushed open the door of the missile control room. He saw Charles sitting alone in front of the control table, wearing surgical masks, latex gloves, disposable aprons, and covering his uniform tightly. The next day, Charles was transferred out of combat duty and thrown into low-stress work on a supply ship. Thereafter, he began attempting suicide in the remotest corners of the warship. However, each time he was caught in time. In 1984, he was granted a medical discharge, leaving only one line in his file, medical reason, unspecified. In order to continue to smell the disinfectant water, Charles enrolled in a nursing school at Mountainside Hospital in Montclair. There, he became the monitor of the nursing class, graduated in 1987, and began to work in the burn ward of St. Barnabas Medical Center in New Jersey. Meanwhile, Charles met his wife, and their first daughter was also born in the late autumn of the same year. In the delivery room, Charles was holding his daughter, and his wife was lying in bed. Looking at Charles, she felt that life would get better and better. However, Charles began to behave abnormally. First, there was a strange smell in the kitchen, and then their pet dog was also abused by Charles for no reason. On the night of June 11, 1988, in the cardiac monitoring ward of St. Barnabas Medical Center, Charles inserted a syringe into a patient's foreline. Inside was no life-saving antibiotic, but an intravenous drug overdose sufficient to stop the heart instantly. The 72-year-old senior judge was declared dead from a drug allergy in the early hours. This was the first murder Charles openly admitted to. Over the following 4 years, he sent at least 11 more patients to the morgue. Like a ghost, Charles wandered the wards, disguising each murder as the patient's natural complication. In early 1992, the pharmacy finally discovered several contaminated 4 bags, prompting management to launch an internal investigation. However, Charles had already submitted his resignation letter. It was only after his murderous actions were later uncovered that the investigation concluded that deaths were highly likely caused by Charles, the former nurse, and the exact number of patient fatalities could not be fully determined. After just 1 month of rest, Charles put on his ID badge again and returned to work at Warren Hospital in Phillipsburg. His new stage was a geriatric ward, and his chosen weapon of murder remained digoxin. With 3 excessive doses, 3 elderly women had their hearts stopped in their sleep. Before her death, the last victim opened her eyes and vaguely said to her daughter, "A sneaky male nurse gave me a shot." The victim's family relayed this to the doctors, but it was dismissed as a baseless fabrication. In 1993, Charles' wife obtained a restraining order against him out of fear that he might pose a danger to her and their 2 children. She claimed that Charles had added lighter fluid to people's drinks, burned his daughter's books, and left their daughter with a babysitter for an entire week. Although Charles denied these allegations, insisted that his wife was exaggerating, she remained convinced that he was suffering from psychosis. After their divorce, Charles moved into a damp basement apartment. He considered resigning from his job, but the court ordered him to pay child support, forcing him to remain in the nursing profession. In the late night of March 1993, Charles pried open the door of a female colleague's home and entered the bedroom through the staircase. The woman and her son were sound asleep, but Charles merely stood by their bedside for a moment before leaving the house. No one knew why he did it. Later, he began stalking the same colleague, ultimately leading her to file charges against him. Charles was sentenced to 1 year of probation for unlawful entry. In the early hours of the day after the sentencing, he attempted suicide once again. Following this incident, Charles took 2 months off and received treatment for depression at 2 psychiatric hospitals. Surrounded by white walls, soft toothbrushes, and plastic cups for scheduled medication, he outwardly complied with taking his pills, yet still made 2 more suicide attempts during this period. In late September of that year, in the dead of night, a 91-year-old woman in the cancer ward reported that a tall, thin man, not her assigned nurse, had pushed open her door and injected her with an unknown substance. The following day, she passed away seemingly of natural causes. Her son wept over her body, crying and saying, "Yesterday, my mother said she wanted to eat pudding tomorrow." Due to mounting public pressure, hospital administrators arranged for a polygraph test. But Charles passed the test, and as a result, he continued to work at the hospital. In 1994, Charles changed the job, began working in the intensive care unit of Hunterdon Medical Center, signing a 3-year contract. For the first 2 years, Charles claimed he had not harmed anyone. However, when the police came to retrieve the records in 2003, the medical files from those 2 years had long been completely destroyed by a shredder. Charles only admitted that between January and September of 1996, he had used digoxin to kill 5 patients. Later, Morristown Memorial Hospital took Charles in, but dismissed him within less than 6 months due to his failure to meet performance standards. After half a year unemployed and with child support arrears prompting a court warning, the immense pressure led Charles to seek treatment for his depression at the emergency room of Warren Hospital. Shortly afterward, he was once again briefly admitted to a psychiatric institution. In February, the Liberty Nursing and Rehabilitation Center in Allentown, Pennsylvania, was severely short-staffed and immediately assigned Charles to the ventilator unit. In the early hours of one morning, a colleague saw through a door crack that Charles was holding a syringe in one hand and pressing down on a patient's wrist with the other. The next day, that patient was found with a fractured arm, and shortly afterward, Charles caused another patient's death. In the end, the hospital administration fired Charles on grounds of improper medication administration procedures, but attributed the death to another nurse's documentation error. After being dismissed, Charles promptly joined Easton Hospital. On December 30th, 1998, following the death of an elderly patient with heart failure, his blood test revealed extremely high levels of digoxin. However, the hospital's internal investigation still yielded no results. In those days, there was a nationwide shortage of nurses in the United States. Even with Charles' history of mental illness and the numerous patients he had killed, all he needed to do was switch hospitals to resume working and resume murdering patients. There was no blacklist, no mental health reporting system, and no hospital was willing to take action against Charles for fear of facing lawsuits from patients' families. So, in this bizarre way, a serial killer was effectively safeguarded by the system. In March 1999, the burn unit of Allentown's Lehigh Valley Hospital was short on night shift nurses, and Charles was successfully hired. There, he murdered one patient and attempted to kill another. Before hospital administrators could fully investigate, Charles resigned for personal reasons and immediately secured a job in the cardiac care unit at St. Luke's Hospital. Over 3 years, Charles killed at least 5 patients and attempted to kill 2 others. In the early hours of January 11, 2000, Charles attempted to kill himself. He moved a small charcoal grill into his bathtub, drew the plastic curtain, and hoped to die from carbon monoxide poisoning. However, neighbors detected the smell of smoke and notified the fire department and police, who intervened and saved Charles. The real breakthrough in the case came in April 2002, when a night shift nurse discovered several medication vials while taking out the trash. Pharmacy records showed these medications had never been logged. Hospital administrators quietly launched an internal audit and found that the person who had taken the drugs was Charles. They gave him 2 options: resign voluntarily with a letter of recommendation to work at another hospital, or be fired with a permanent stain on his record. In June, Charles chose to resign. Shortly after, several colleagues jointly petitioned the Lehigh County District Attorney, suspecting that Charles had used those medications to murder patients. However, the case was dismissed due to lack of direct evidence. After a 3-month break, Charles began working in the critical care unit of the Somerset Medical Center in New Jersey. By then, Charles's mental illness had worsened significantly. On June 10, 2003, he injected a bolus of insulin into the foreline of Philip, a 60-year-old retired teacher. Although Philip was resuscitated, he died 6 months later from genuine heart failure. As a result, the hospital only recorded the hypoglycemic incident as an accidental event. In July, hospital administrators discovered that Charles had repeatedly violated protocols. Around the same time, the executive director of the New Jersey Poison Information and Education System warned them that at least 4 suspicious drug overdoses indicated an employee was secretly killing patients. However, it was not until October that the police were notified, after another patient had died unexpectedly. Following the incident, the state's health department urgently retrieved medical records and discovered that similar cases had occurred as early as August but had not been reported. Further investigation traced a pattern spanning many years, with similar deaths occurring at multiple hospitals where Charles had worked. To avoid legal liability, Somerset Medical Center immediately fired Charles, claiming he had lied on his job application and that his actions were unrelated to the hospital itself. On December 12, 2003, Charles was arrested by police at an unassuming restaurant in New Jersey. He was charged with 1 count of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. 2 days later, during an interrogation, Charles confessed to the officers the names of 2 victims, stating, "I did it all." He then added, Over 16 years, about 40 victims, I never kept an exact count. In April 2004, Charles signed 13 guilty pleas for murder and 2 for attempted murder before a judge. As part of the plea agreement, he promised to cooperate with the police in exchange for not being sentenced to death. A month later, feeling that his cooperation had not been thorough enough, he confessed to murdering 3 additional victims. In November, Charles admitted in an Allentown courtroom to killing 6 patients and 3 attempted murders. He also taunted the judge by saying, "Your Honor, you need to step down." On March 2, 2006, Charles was sentenced to 18 consecutive life sentences in New Jersey, meaning he would not be eligible for parole until 2403. 8 days later, he was brought to Lehigh County, Pennsylvania, where a judge sentenced him to 6 additional life sentences. Today, Charles is still incarcerated at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton. As part of his plea agreement, investigators occasionally visit him to confirm details about additional victims. In the interrogation room, Charles described his motive for murder with a twisted logic that almost sounded compassionate. "I simply couldn't bear to witness or hear attempts to save the victims' lives. I administered overdoses to end their suffering, to prevent hospital staff from tormenting them. But most of his victims were actually in recovery and would soon have been discharged." He then added, "I can't remember clearly. Those years are like a fog." His memory had grown hazy. He could not recall how many he had killed or why he had chosen them. Sometimes, Charles firmly denied committing murders at specific hospitals, but when police presented medical records, he would relent. "It looks like it was me. I'll admit it then." Like a drop of mercury, Charles slid from one hospital to another. Over 16 years, he caused many deaths. In those days, New Jersey and Pennsylvania only required hospitals to report extremely egregious cases of death. But what constituted extremely egregious? It had to be the arrest of the murderer on the spot in the ward, a guilty plea, and a blood test used as evidence. Suspicion, anomalies, and irregularities did not count. In reality, many hospitals vaguely understood what Charles did, but none were willing to risk being sued by the patient's family and report Charles. In the wake of this case, New Jersey passed the Patient Safety Act of 2004, which for the first time mandated the reporting of serious preventable adverse events. In 2005, additional loopholes were closed. Hospitals were now required to retain records of employee complaints, medication errors, and disciplinary actions for 7 years, and synchronize them with a state database. Other states followed suit and established background investigation systems for healthcare practitioners. But the cost of these systematic improvements was paid with the lives of dozens or hundreds of people who can never be brought back.